Welcome to another honest conversation on the Jewish question. Please like, comment, subscribe below if you think those conversations are important, as I do. Tensions are rising around the country and Jews are in the crosshairs again. Just last week in Orange County, a man who had a kill list of Jewish leaders pleads guilty of planning an attack on 3 local houses of worship. And I think, for me, it's important that we try to understand why people feel the way they do about this particular group of people. And I wanted to have these very open conversations about the topic in order to really get to the root of this. So I invited retired professor of psychology at CSULB, Professor Kevin MacDonald, to speak with Kabbalist Dr. Michael Laitman. Professor MacDonald is a prolific author. Among your controversial works, I would say, are A People That Shall Dwell Alone, Judaism as a Group in the Evolutionary Strategy, Separation and Its Discontents Towards an Evolutionary Theory of Anti-Semitism, and The Culture of Critique, an evolutionary analysis of Jewish involvement in 20th century intellectual and political movements. So really to the heart of the matter. Also, Dr. Laitman with us is a PhD in biocybernetics and is considered the foremost authority on authentic Kabbalah. And its surprising explanation of the Jewish question, as I found, and hopefully we can kind of get to the bottom of Kabbalah's view on the topic as well. He has also written extensively on the topic, most notably, Why Do They Hate Us? The Solution to the Phenomenon of Anti-Semitism, according to the Wisdom of Kabbalah, currently in translation, and Like a Bundle of Reeds, Why Unity and Mutual Guarantee Are the Call of the Hour. So, as I said, I'd like to have an open conversation, and I'll jump in if I feel something needs to be clarified for the viewers, or if we need to move on. But essentially, I want this to flow as much as possible. I want to start with you, Professor MacDonald. You write that, and I'm paraphrasing, Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy to enhance the ability of Jews to outcompete non-Jews for resources. You argue that Judaism fosters in Jews a series of marked genetic traits, including above-average verbal intelligence, strong tendency toward collectivist behavior, ethnocentrism, intelligence and wealth, psychological intensity, and even aggressiveness. And you also say that Jews are motivated by sometimes hostility towards the American Christian culture. So all those things, out of all those things, I would like for you, if you can, to hear, how do you define Jews? Like, what is this group that I think kind of defies definition a little bit, but what is this? And what would you say is the primary cause today for this meteoric rise in anti-Semitism in the US, really the root cause of it?
Well, defining Jews, I guess in general, I have taken Jewish statements at their word. For example, in my book, Culture of Critique, a major point of it was to establish that the people I was dealing with had a strong Jewish identity. That is, that they thought of themselves as Jewish and that they thought of themselves as pursuing Jewish interests. So in chapter on Jewish leftists, quite often they did not advertise this, but you could determine it because of their associations in some cases, the policies that they advocated, especially what they would change their attitudes depending on, say, the Soviet Union's attitude towards Israel, that sort of thing. So I have not really invested. I mean, right now, if you say who's a Jew, what's a Jew, you have to say, well, what I tend to do, looking at the American situation, say, is to focus on where Jewish power lies. One is the Israel lobby, for example. And these are, without doubt, strong identified Jews. Look at the ADL, other organizations like that. And to determine, we want to know how influential they are, what policies they're pursuing. Are these policies in the interest of the wider society? And that sort of thing. So I think right now, the main sources of anti-Semitism in America really are coming both from the left and the right. And I think that's one reason that Jewish activists are very concerned. Just today on Twitter, I posted something from the UK where there's a great deal of concern about supposed anti-Semitism in the Labor Party. Jeremy Corbyn, especially, that they are tolerating this. Of course, there's a large Muslim contingent now in the Labor Party, but there's also a lot of non-Jewish liberals who are very concerned about Israel. They think Israel is a colonialist state. They think they're oppressing the Palestinians. And so that it's becoming more and more common on the left. I noticed just the other day in California that the California Democratic Party had a battle on its hands when it wanted to endorse Israel or wanted to have a plank on the Middle East in their platform, in the political platform. And it was difficult. The Jewish activists really had to apply a lot of pressure because it's not easy these days. I've seen surveys among Democrats now that only about 50% favor the Israelis over the Palestinians. So that's certainly got to be of concern to Jewish activists, and it is a big concern. But then on the right, you have the concerns about the fact that Jewish organizations have strongly backed multicultural immigration to America. They have really emphasized, the multiculturalism, and that's a chapter in my book, The Culture of Critique, where the Jewish activism on behalf of immigration laws in America, the 1965 law in particular, but that has not changed. Jewish organizations have been gung-ho about, very enthusiastic about immigration, whether it's, all the laws related to that. And if you look at the Twitter feed of the Anti-Defamation League, they are constantly advocating, open borders basically now, where anybody who comes here basically can stay unless they're serious criminals or something.
So the question is, there something
reasons now, I think.
So the question is there something specific, or is it a collection of policies and behaviors, or is there something that's changed? I mean, a lot of those things we can see, anti-Semitism, hate towards the Jewish people throughout history, not just now. So I know it's not only a sort of a political thing. What would you say is the crux of the matter? How do you really explain that attitude towards this group?
Well, I think that, as I said, I think that the big issues are the ones that I mentioned. In the case of the left, it's really Israel as a state that is ethno-nationalist and avowedly so, and what they're doing to the Palestinians. I think, for example, Barack Obama was probably the least favorable president towards Israel since Eisenhower, probably. And I think it's just that he identified really with the Palestinians. He had a Muslim background to some extent. He identified more with third world peoples as a non-white person. And I think that's what is very common now. And it's just been increasing. I think for a long time, the Israel lobby was very effective in sort of producing this image of Israel as, democracy, human rights, and all that. But I think it's really frayed at the edges. It's pretty hard to hide what the Netanyahu governments have been doing, what's been going on in Israel. And so anyway, but again, on the right, there are different issues having to do with multiculturalism primarily, but also, Hollywood influences. This is not as much an issue with me, where I have not written that much about it, but there's certainly a strong Jewish influence in the media, Jewish ownership of the media, Jewish writers in the media, and so on, and pushing basically liberal values, and being very concerned about Donald Trump as a populist. Those are the big issues, and I think those things have been a crescendo. I think that Donald Trump probably had something to do with the upsurge of concern, because these issues, when he was running, I mean, he was widely seen as a Nazi, basically, many depictions in the mainstream media of Trump as a Nazi, doing Nazi salutes and calling him the Fuhrer and that sort of thing. And this was the very mainstream media. And especially, interesting with the Jewish neoconservatives. Now, these are Jews who are nominally Republican, but they had a very strong position in the Republican Party when it comes to foreign policy. They really dominated Republican foreign policy, and they probably still do in a lot of ways. But they bailed on Trump completely. People like Max Boot, William Kristol, and Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post. So these people just, completely wrote Trump off as and I think, and it was pretty clearly because of diversity issues. Again, the diversity issues when it comes to the American situation, Jewish activists, whether it's on the left or the neoconservatives, have been all in favor of multiculturalism and immigration and that sort of thing. And they saw Trump as a threat to that. So I think Trump's rhetoric on immigration has sort of ramped the whole thing up. Of course, he's been very friendly to Israel. But I don't think that has not really changed the equation here. These never Trump neoconservatives still hate him, despite all that he's done for Israel.
Yeah.
And on the left, it hasn't changed anything.
Right. Okay, so I kind of gather this certain influence that the Jews on the left and on the right have on the culture here in America, the decisions they make, the influence they have. I want to ask Dr. Laitman. Dr. Laitman, you say that actually Kabbalah says that Jews are not a race or an ethnicity. They are not a religion or nationality. They really defy definition in the traditional sense. How does the wisdom of Kabbalah define who is a Jew, and what are they doing or maybe not doing that brings the wrath of the world on them?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to have such a conversation with Professor Kevin MacDonald. And let's hope that we can both share with each other some new insights. Jews, it's similar to what's written in scriptures. It's a group. It's a group that was gathered around the school of Abraham in ancient Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia. In those times, the cradle of human civilization took place there. Human society was going through a crisis. People were living well. They were socially balanced. But then, human egoism erupted. And that meant that people started fighting, conflicts started growing, rifts between people and communities and societies. That's the symbol. That is the symbol of the Tower of Babel. That symbol of how people stopped understanding each other. So in that ancient Babylon, there was a spiritual leader. He was one of those idol worshippers. A lot of the people then were sort of idol worshippers. And he researched what was going on. What he understood was that human egoism was simply evolving. And that's why people then suddenly became unfriendly towards each other, hostile towards each other. So he called upon everyone and tried to tell people that we have to rise above that growth of the human ego, above the hatred and animosity, and try to create a positive human connection on top of that growing separation. Some people of those Babylonians followed him. Some didn't. That includes King Nimrod, who was a king at that time in those areas. And so what Abraham did was he called upon the people who understood what he was saying. He told them, come along, and he gathered them. And so he taught them how to practice being connected. being together despite the growing ego. That was a condition that he articulated as love covers all crimes. What that means is that the connection needs to cover all the gaps and differences between people and to make them one. It's actually a simple formula. It's very not simple to carry out, but because we're talking about a time that is about 3,500 years ago, some people were able to do that back then. And so he put together a group, and he led that group. And so that group later called itself Israel. It's actually a combination of two words, Israel, which means directly towards the higher force of nature. They understood that force to be a force of integration and connection, unconditional connection. And so they started to direct themselves towards that force, in line with that force. Later on, there was a conflict in Babylon between that group and the rest of Babylon. And Abraham led that group towards the land of Canaan, what is today's Israel, and that group grew and grew over time. What's interesting about that group is that they used to practice that principle, that the connection between them is the main thing, is the most important thing, to be connected above all differences. And so they existed that way a few hundred years until they began to separate. They couldn't hold on to that connection, and that's because naturally human ego is developing, it's evolving from generation to generation, and people grow further apart, and they stop feeling that they're interconnected, that they're inherently connected. And so we should mention here that I'm saying people came to this group from all the different nations, from all the different cultures and nations who lived in Babylon. And therefore, they didn't have any familial connection at first. They were very diverse. They were a diverse group of people until, as long as that concept of connection held them together, they were as one people. But when the ego erupted later, they separated and they began to be just like the rest of the nations who existed in ancient Babylon. And so, since then, that group exists, but it doesn't know its origin and why it acts the way it does. These people are actually very different from each other. In terms of race, in terms of DNA, you can find traces of a lot of different nations. They come from all the nations of the world. And so today, they exist to this day in this situation where, on the one hand, they exist to be able to serve as a model of rising above the human ego and living together in a connected fashion as a symbol for, or as a model for the rest of human society. That's also something that that scriptures explain. On the other hand, they fell from that degree of connection, of higher human connection, and they're actually separate from each other and in conflict. And what ties them together today is only the animosity from the rest of the nations of the world. Why do the nations of the world feel hatred towards the Jews? Because the nations of the world feel that this group, and I'm calling it a group, I'm not calling it a nation. It's not a nation in the sense, or a people in the sense that they came from a single family, like all the other nations. That group exists because, according to the general evolutionary plan, and this is something that there are many sources that describe this, this group needs to demonstrate to people how to connect, how to be correctly, properly connected. If that group becomes properly connected, as it was connected in the days of Abraham, then all the rest of the nations, all the rest of humanity will sense that. And they will also be able to connect in a new way. Because what existed in that group is actually the DNA of all the nations of the world, because they all come from the cradle of civilization in ancient Babylon. So if they begin to unite, to connect, then the rest of the nations can also come together. And if they don't, then there's conflicts and problems and crises in the whole world. And that's why the whole world, all the nations of the world, sense this deep-seated demand towards the Jews, towards that group that's called the people of Israel. But human beings don't understand that group too. Today, most of them don't understand, besides Kabbalists. I'm only talking about Kabbalists, which is a very small group, subgroup, a few thousand people who engage in the wisdom of Kabbalah, and they research these things and have their own sources and literature that explains this for a long time, and it has a specific teaching. But most of the people and that group don't know it, and the nations feel this demand that towards the Jews, that the Jews are causing evils in the world, and it's true. But why? Because they don't serve as that model of connection that needs to be a model for the entire world. And so that's the state that we're coming to today. For now, I think let's stop here.
I have to say, unless Professor MacDonald, you want to jump in, I have a question, because it sounds as if you write that people inherently feel that they belong to different groups, and that the general media climate kind of suppresses that, tries to kind of just blur the lines, and we're all the same, and that stresses people out, that threatens their identity, their well-being, on the one hand. And then, Dr. Laitman, you say, but, well, Jews have to actually connect people. Are those things at odds? Are we supposed to all be connected, or each group needs to have its own kind of territory, its own sovereignty? How?
No. Ultimately, even though at the essence, at the basis, there are mostly 70 different nations. Of course, there are many other nations here and there, but most of the core of human civilization developed in ancient Babylon among these 70 nations. And so eventually all of us need to be connected. All of humanity, and by the way, that includes all the rest of the levels of nature, still vegetative, animate, and human. They all need to be one integrated system. This is something that general evolution is leading us towards. Like it or not, we're going to have to take on a shape that is round. This integral connection between all parts of nature is something that is closing in on us. And we become increasingly connected and interconnected among cultures and nationalities, even though we don't want it, because we're all inherently egoistic, but there's no choice. We're under a general plan of nature that pushes us to come together, whether we like it or not. And so what's happening with the Jews here, and I'm referring to the wisdom of Kabbalah, that the Jews themselves, most of them are not aware of. But the wisdom of Kabbalah possesses a method of human connection, of how to connect everyone together in a way that actually works for human society and nature. And then the negative conflicts will not take place. Every individual will be able to realize himself in a friendly way towards everyone else. This is something that exists deep in the wisdom of Kabbalah, in the method of human connection. And that's the problem here, that the people of Israel, the Jews themselves, they don't know. what they've got. They don't know what they possess, and they don't know why they're hated. I agree. The nations of the world hate the Jews, and they're right. They have an instinct. They feel instinctively that Jews are not fulfilling a certain thing they need to be filling, a certain function they need to be doing in the world. They're doing the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing, and it shows through how they deal with commerce and banking and etc. and government power and all of that. It's totally not what they're supposed to be doing. So there is a problem here. It's a problem of explaining, first of all, to both Jews and non-Jews, what is the origin of the people of Israel and what is the historical, natural role that it has to fulfill. And at this point, I think that we may be able to find some mutual understanding with people who feel the criticism and who are openly, vocally critical about the people of Israel and the Jews. And maybe in that sort of mutual way, from both directions, we can try to show the Jews what they're supposed to be doing, how to fulfill their historical function, their role, and then the rest of the nations of the world will be able to understand that as well, and we can create a better human connection. Otherwise, we're not going to see peace in the world. We're not going to see any positive connection in the world. Hatred will only grow because the human egoism is always growing.
Professor MacDonald, what do you think?
I don't know much about Kabbalah at all. And my perspective has always been based on evolutionary biology, psychology. So, for example, just thinking about ancient Babylon, my understanding was that, and this is the part of my first book, was that Babylon conquered Israel and then took away the sort of upper echelons of the society, and that within Babylon they remained separate. When they came back to Israel, I mean, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah make it very clear that they were very concerned that the people of Israel who'd been left behind had intermarried quite a bit. So there was a strong concern about the sort of genetic integrity of the group. And there certainly has been admixture with the various Jewish groups over historical time in Europe and everywhere. But there is a genetic core that's been revealed by population genetic research. So I do think that Israel and Jewish, traditional Jewish groups took great pains to wall themselves off from other people. I realize that one aspect of Jewish sort of religious thinking and ideology has always been the idea that Jews are a sort of light unto the nations, and I think that is what's coming out here. That Jews should be a model of human understanding and human, getting together and not setting up barriers. I don't think that has been reflected in Jewish behavior over the centuries. In traditional Jewish societies in Europe and elsewhere have been strongly concerned to sort of wall themselves off. That's why my first book is called "The People That Shall Dwell Alone," and that's a very clear message in what we call the Old Testament, that you should remain separate, that they should, the intermarriage is a major concern in the Old Testament. Repeated injunctions about that. When in Exodus. When the Jews come back from Egypt, very large concern there about intermarriage. You have to kill them all, make slaves of some. But the intermarriage was on the minds of the prophets, and repeated in many books of the Old Testament. I've documented that. So, and that continued throughout Jewish history. I'm mostly familiar with Jewish history in the West, in Europe, but that was certainly a big aspect. Now that's broken down to a great extent in terms of intermarriage in America. You have a very open society. The walls have come down. You don't have Jewish communal governments, but there's still a lot of voluntary Jewish associations, a hugely very organized community, organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. So I don't think that the Jewish history has been characterized by openness to other peoples, and we certainly don't see that in Israel. If you look at Israeli immigration policy, it's very much slanted towards people who are Jewish and have to sort of confirm their Jewish ancestry in some way. Conversions are very difficult. They have to be done under the supervision of the Orthodox, and so on. So I don't see traditional Judaism or Judaism in general as open to other peoples. It's a nice ideology. I think it actually reflects much more Christian thinking throughout the ages, that Christians have been open to other groups. I'm writing a book now on the history of really on Western peoples. And, one of the themes really is that Western groups have been very open to assimilation with other groups. I mean, with the Romans, their whole strategy really was to conquer groups, but then over the long run, they would absorb these groups. And so the Romans, say in the 4th century AD, were completely different people, really, than the Romans.
I want to kind of, again, historically, it's probably a fascinating debate, but I want to bring us back to kind of today as much as possible. Dr. Laitman, you talk about also the growth of the human ego. Is this something? How is that reflected in the general society? And are Jews able to work with this, or are Jews just part of the same problem? Like what's happening here, really?
Well, you're asking me, I guess. I see human ego as a human sort of constant and universal. That is, I see self-interest as fundamental to humans in general, that people act out of their perceived self-interest. I don't know if this has been growing. It certainly is rampant, but I think it's always been pretty rampant.
So how do we deal with it? That's really the question. Like how do we work with it? And let's say you remove the Jews from the equation here in America, for example, by some, I don't know.
I think the problem is that say if you ask, as many people as sort of the establishment culture in America is doing now. I think what is being asked of the European population in America and in Europe, Western Europe especially, is that they should give up their identities. They should stop trying to have borders. They should open borders to other peoples. They should take in refugees and immigrants from everywhere and build multicultural, multi-ethnic societies. And that is sort of the goal. That's the ideal of really. I think that this is in our culture we constantly hear the refrain: "Diversity is our strength." It's what we should be aiming at. It makes us stronger. It brings us together. But the reality is that multi-ethnic countries are not strong. They are divided ethnically. And if you ask one group to lay down their identities, to give up their identities, it would only be remotely feasible if everybody else did the same thing at the same time. And that's not going to happen.
That's the point. So, Dr. Laitman, what is the solution? I mean, are we saying that unity means a loss of identity, or is there a different way to unite here? I mean, how do we overcome this situation?
Well, the wisdom of Kabbalah asserts that we have to try to bring ourselves towards connection to the point of actual love towards each other. We have to internalize that humanity is actually one thing. We ultimately are one people. Again, this is the same maxim of love covers all crimes and all differences. In fact, I think that in all religions also, these things are deeply seated, they're there, but they need to be realized. The wisdom of Kabbalah deals with the practice, how to realize it. That's the main thing about Kabbalah. It doesn't belong to Judaism or any other religion. It explains that this is a law of nature that we need to be in line with, that we need to be balanced with. And so, of course, human beings cannot find that connection by themselves. Of course, people can't connect. But as we grow and develop it from generation to generation, we grow in our ego, and people become more alienated towards each other, more different from each other, then we're going to suffer more crises throughout the planet. And also, the hatred to Jews will rise. That's an instinctive process. It doesn't even have to do in places where Jews existed. As humanity evolves, people instinctively, inherently feel that the Jews, that group possess something that is a key, something that they're hiding from us, from the world, from the rest of the world. What is it? They don't know exactly. But they have a certain suspicion towards them. They have a certain sentiment, and that eventually unfolds as hatred. In this case, I'm addressing only the Jews. The Jews need to recognize what they possess, and it's that method of human connection. And they have to first practice it on themselves. They're horribly divided in so many ways. You can even see this in American Jews, just how divided and different they are. They have to first acknowledge the model that they're supposed to serve for all nations, and then, in that way, they'll be able to fulfill their function in the general system, and anti-Semitism will subside. Otherwise, it will grow to the point of even another kind of Holocaust. And by not wanting to make that model of connection, we are crafting a very bad future for ourselves. That's what I would say. The wisdom of Kabbalah talks about a lot more aspects of this and details. Also, with regards to ancient Babylon, what the professor said, I'd like to just point out that I talked about specifically the time of about 3,500 or 4,000 years ago, meaning before the exile of Babylon. You mentioned the ruin of the first temple and the second temple. I talked about the times even before that, times of Nimrod, not Nebuchadnezzar. So, yeah.
So I'm interested. We want to get to some sort of a solution. I mean, I think it's clear that there's an issue. It's clear that somehow the Jews are kind of not, for whatever reason, that I understand that Kabbalah explains this group that is made of representatives of all the nations. They have a certain role, a certain influence that they do have to exert, but instead they're exerting different kind of influence, one that threatens the kind of the social fabric of the country, in this case, in the United States. And Professor MacDonald, you're one of the also co-directors of the American Freedom Party. How do you see? I mean, what is the solution? I mean, I know that talking about it already gets the kind of reactions, very extreme reactions about some of the things that these organizations call for, or even some of those texts. They're dubbed as neo-Nazi or anti-Semitic or all those things. But really, what do you think is the solution to the issue, and is the solution of the problems in this country tied to the solution of somehow the attitude of the Jews?
My view, I guess, is I certainly don't advocate violence towards Jews. However, my view, what I would say is that if Jews, what I've always advocated is that Jews should simply stop what they're doing, and that would mean offering the Palestinians a good deal that they would be happy with. The old two-state solution would have been wonderful, but it's not going to happen now.
Let's focus on the United States, just for the sake. Because
let's talk about because that's the big issue on the left in the United States, and I think that would diffuse anti-Semitism on the left. But on the right, if Jewish organizations would simply stop advocating multiculturalism and immigration and the loss of identity among Europeans, I think that would diffuse anti-Semitism on the right. So my view is that yes, Jewish behaviors is critical. Jewish attitudes are critical, and the first thing that should change really are Jewish attitudes, because in fact the attitudes of the white European population have changed in general. Not me personally, but in general, Europeans have been very open to this. They have bought into this. Even now, around 40% of the Democrat votes, more than half the Democrat votes. So, and substantial, like 40% of the American white people vote for the Democratic Party, which is really all about open borders and all about loss of white identity and all concern about racism and concern about other peoples. So these people are very open in the way that is being advocated for Jews and everybody. So I'd say that about 40% of the white population, at least, and really more than that, probably a majority, because an awful lot of Americans who vote for Republicans are also really pretty much on board with all that. But they voted for Republicans for a variety of other reasons. But anyway, so I would say that the white population is way further along than the Jewish population towards loss of identity and to not being concerned about the massive inundation by other peoples, where we don't see that we don't see any changes in attitude, loss of identity among Jews. I mean, I see that as still very robust despite intermarriage. You have very powerful organizations like the Anti-Defamation League who are advising the big tech companies like Amazon and Facebook and Twitter. They are actively removing accounts, including my videos, my books, and so on. So there's an awful lot of censorship going on, and the Anti-Defamation League is really very centrally involved in all that. So what I'm saying is that if really, if the Kabbalah really does hold the key, the first people that should be doing it and demonstrating it in a way they have not at all demonstrated it to this point is the Jewish population in the United States.
Dr. Laitman, in your book, Like a Bundle of Reeds, you write that in today's world, the reigning tone and atmosphere are of self-entitlement, egoism to the point of narcissism, and the majority of Jews, progenitors of the tenet, love your neighbor as yourself, not only sit by and watch as egoism celebrates, but also join the party. Many of us are leading the pack, as you say. So what, according to Kabbalah, should Jews do today? Do you think it's feasible to even demand it from the Jews in America, as Professor MacDonald even expressed?
Unfortunately, as much as I try to address American Jews and also Jews around the world and in Israel, I find it very hard to find an open ear to. They don't want to hear. It's a very stiff-necked people, and unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that after years and years of doing this, I wouldn't say I'm successful. It's difficult to explain to them that we are to blame for the nations of the world's attitude towards us, and that a lot depends on our behavior, on that we need to change our shape, our attitude, and the attitude towards us will change as well, and all nations will then accept us differently. I, unfortunately, can't change this. I would very much like this to change, but I don't find myself capable. I also pass very harsh criticism on Israel. I myself belong to Israel. I'm a part of the people of Israel, and I'm Jewish. But from knowing just how much that nation has to serve as an example for the rest of the world, and how much influence it does have on the world, even though it's a very small group, it has a very disproportionate influence, and we see that. But it's supposed to use that influence to provide a positive example for positive behavior, and then the whole world will change for the better. But I'm talking about this a lot for a long time. In the meantime, not very successful. But I do see that there were many people, known people, such as Henry Ford, for example, who wrote about the role of the Jewish people. He recognized it. He knew about it, and he himself said that the Jews have to provide that method for the whole world, and others, meaning there are many people from the nations of the world who are not necessarily friendly towards Israel, but they understand their role, and I agree with them. So let's hope that everyone from his direction will be able to first awaken the Jews that they have to change, and accordingly a change will happen in the rest of the world as well.
Thank you. We're about to wrap up. I have two small questions for you, Professor MacDonald. I think people are interested as well, because you started your career as a libertarian. Did your PhD on the behavioral development of wolves. I'm curious, what made you kind of change, or is it not a change? Was it a natural progression to the views and and the actions you hold now?
Well, it was a huge change. As you say, I started out as an evolutionary biologist, studied wolves, then I studied children, and I really taught developmental psychology, child psychology for 30 years. But my background really was evolutionary biology, and one of the big one theoretical questions in evolutionary biology is whether groups are an important vehicles, we say, of natural selection. Are they something more? Are there something more than individuals going on, individual self-interest? And I became very interested in the idea of group selection, that it could exist among humans, because humans are able to create groups that punish people who defect from the group, who are not on page with the group. And I originally studied the Spartans, ancient Greece, but then I thought I'd do a bigger project with Jewish groups, and that's how the first book came along. And that was well received, and it's still available on Amazon. Everything else has been censored, but People That Shall Dwell Alone essentially talks about how Jewish groups composed themselves and created barriers between themselves and other groups. How they had, how they regulated dealings within the group, and how they regulated dealings outside the group, and that sort of thing. So it was very much centered on groups as an evolutionary vehicle. But then I just kept reading, and when you read a lot about Jewish groups, you can't avoid reading about anti-Semitism, and so I started compiling material on that, and that led to the other two books, really. So, it's been a long journey. And when I started, I didn't really have much knowledge of this. I thought, an interesting intellectual project that it seemed overwhelming a lot, and in a lot of ways it is. Because so much has been written, but so I evolved. I started this around 1991 or so. First book came out in 1994, then 1998, and the other two. So, and then, I knew the last two, especially the last one, would be controversial, because it was basically the idea that Jewish Americans had different interests in the construction of America, and construction of American culture, than non-Jews, and so that then became controversial. It was a long process, a long road, and I certainly had no idea where I was going to end up when I started.
Thanks. Dr. Laitman, I think I'd like to ask you, you started as a scientist, you studied cybernetics, also the study of systems and nature. What made you transition from that very kind of rational perspective to Kabbalah that many people think, is it mysticism, belief? What made you make the switch, or is this a switch really?
I actually didn't think about finding myself in Kabbalah at all. Yes, my profession was biocybernetics, which deals with the operating systems of both the human body and actually the entire universe as a single system, and the interdependence of all those subsystems. And when I started engaging in all that and studying that, I started seeing that there's a problem here. Because all of nature and the whole universe is built towards greater and greater integration. It's geared towards connection. That starts from the Big Bang and continues along this line. And so in human society, there are different processes that seem to take place. And that conflict led me to research it further and further, and eventually it led me to see what is the true origin of that group of Jews and everything that we just talked about. And so I researched that, and I did my PhD on that as well, and I also wrote books that are very controversial and not accepted by Judaism, especially the religious part of it, but Jews in general. And I understand why, because it goes against their firmly established views. But this is what I'm engaged in, and I believe that if we try to look at things more broadly and go above all the different petty things that are happening today, even take like the feuds between the Democrats and the Republicans among American Jews and so on. And also, if you look at Israel, I don't think that American Jews today are concerned about Israel at all, or that they feel connected to Israel. A big portion of them. When I come to the U.S. and I speak to American Jews, I find that they feel Israel is a very foreign thing. Many of them wouldn't like to hear a word about Israel. And so what's happening here is simple. Again, I say, the world inherently, internally, senses that Jews possess that key to human connection. And if they practice it and enable it, the whole world will be able to do this as well. This is something that a lot of anti-Semitic ideologues write about, and a lot of sages throughout history. It's not that I'm discovering something new here, but we just have to see whether this is the result that we can begin to pursue. And if we will actually pressure that group correctly, that group that we call the people of Israel, and we pressure them to make these correct actions of connection, then we begin to see that the whole structure of human society begins to fall into place, and generally conflicts will take on a different form in reality, in the reality of human society, and that will be the great achievement that I'm looking for. But in any case, I'm thankful to Professor MacDonald for telling me some new things, and so thank you. And I also hope that if you're interested, I'll send you my book, and if you're interested, definitely take a look at it.
Yes, certainly. I've enjoyed this conversation. It's an eye-opener for me. am not familiar, as I said, with the Kabbalah, and it's a different way of thinking. And I wish all the best, really. I know your views are controversial, and they're going to be controversial within the Jewish community. So best of luck on that. And yes, I would like to take a look at your book. I don't, as I said, I'd like to be more informed about Kabbalah.
Professor MacDonald, are you an optimist?
Am I an optimist?
Yeah.
Well, very guardedly. Things have gone very far in this country. We have never been more polarized, except perhaps right before the Civil War, over 150 years ago. So things are really extreme, and there's just pure hatred among these political factions now. I don't know how that is in Israel, but it's just an amazing thing to see that we can't talk to each other anymore. And so I actually wrote an article called, on whether or thinking about a civil war, because I think a lot of people are thinking about that. There have been articles in mainstream media about that they said bad. And so if we ever need a message of coming together and on a reasonable basis that would satisfy people's interests at this point, we need to do that, because we are really heading down towards a completely bifurcated society, to the point where if the other side gets in power, there's absolute meltdown and deep concern and anxiety and hatred that will ensue. When Trump was elected, people on the left just went crazy. If Trump gets elected again, it's going to happen again. But if the Democrat gets elected, it's going to be just the same on the right. They're going to be absolutely freaked out about it, because they do not believe that these people have their interests at heart, and they just and that you just can't talk anymore. So we are headed down a very divided path, and I hope we can change it.
I hope so. Thank you very much, Professor MacDonald, Dr. Laitman, for taking the time. For everyone watching this, please like, share, comment below. We want to hear what you have to say about this topic. We want to keep having these honest conversations. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Good.